that actually the way to achieve prosperity is to have those key things that make a prosperous state. The rights of property, the rule of law, freedom of speech, and democracy. All of these are essential components of success. If you take a single one of them away, you find that the others are not protected. So free speech protects democracy. Democracy protects the rights of property. The rights of property are part of the rule of law. The four always come together.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds.
Thank you for joining us. You are listening to A Radio. And this is The Morning Moment. We're on weekdays, 11:45 Eastern. Follow us on Spreaker.com and click on the like button. I was listening, as you do, well I do anyway, to Fox and Friends this weekend, Saturday to be precise, June 1st. They had a person on by the name of Michael Knowles, and he was asked to talk about free speech. Now, maybe you're asking, why am I talking about this? Well, it's really twofold. The first reason is to highlight what free speech is really all about. And then secondly, to provide clear evidence to my dumb, yes, dumb Canadians who honestly believe that they have free speech. But also, ask yourself, why is the right to free speech so extremely important? You should know the answer, but if you don't, the answer, like most things, is very simple. It's one of the cornerstones of democracy itself, and it shocks me that any American, of all people, where freedom beyond anything else is considered by the world to be sacrosanct, should be questioning this. Here's that piece. The links, as always, will be on my site, but I don't know how long they'll be there because Fox likes to delete them as soon as they go up. So this might be the only place you actually hear it. For a while.
Protesters tried to silence our next guest while speaking at a college campus. Now a new study reveals just what students think about free speech. Michael Knowles weighs in coming up next.
4,000 students attempts to shed some light. 41% say hate speech should not be protected by the First Amendment, while another 68% agree students can't share their true opinions on campus. Nearly 7 in 10 can't share it. Our next guest has some experience being protested on campus. Liquid was thrown at him while he was speaking on the University of Missouri, Kansas City in April. Michael Knowles joins us now. Michael, thanks for being here. So my understanding of the First Amendment is it's not there to protect the easy speech. It's there to protect the stuff we don't like. Why don't kids get that?
Of course. If the First Amendment doesn't protect so-called hate speech, then what's the point of it? You don't need a constitutional amendment to protect popular speech. You need it to protect speech that is unpopular, which some people might define as hateful, but then who's the one who's doing that defining? The problem here is primarily one of ignorance. Thomas Jefferson said that a nation that wants to remain ignorant and free in a state of civilization is hoping for something that never was and never will be. But according to another survey, just 40% of Americans can name any of the rights protected by the First Amendment. Only 56% know that the First Amendment protects free speech. This is a problem primarily of ignorance. Another survey showed that students graduating from elite colleges know less about their civics, less about their government than they did when they were going in. As President Reagan said, freedom is not passed in the bloodstream. You have to teach the next generation. If you don't do it, we're going to lose it very soon.
Michael, you've seen this firsthand. But you mentioned Thomas Jefferson. You know, he's not. You can't have him anymore. They're protesting him. But you talked about it's ultimately who's doing the deciding. Who's the one that decides what's hate speech? And in our politically correct world, which it often is, who is making that call?
Of course. When I was physically assaulted at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, the phrase that was considered hate speech is the phrase, men are not women. If you say, I gave another speech at Cal State LA, I said that the United States should have national borders. I was protested and told that that was hate speech. It's always a subjective question when it comes to what is hate speech and therefore what shouldn't be protected. The argument that they make is that certain speech is violent and it harms people. But actually, there was a study last year, 2018, that showed that so-called trigger warnings and safe spaces and all of this censorship is actually harming the students that it intends to help because it leaves them psychologically fragile. They should learn that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me.
Michael, I'll go out on a limb and say you are a man, maybe the man. Okay, Michael, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it.
I appreciate it, Pete.
Now, the point I take from that piece is again very simple. One so-called hate speech is a subjective one, unquote. That's the point to tell any citizen of any country in the Western world, at least, with our so-called democracy, that this or that is hate speech, is to do one thing and one thing only, to deny that citizen of their right to free speech. And in America's case, that's the First Amendment. And in Canada's case, that's Section 2 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as the name of the document suggests. It is both a disgrace that any country, let alone the United States, should even be debating this. Now, in the second case, in Canada, this is a result of a government that has in its very name the word liberal. But in reality, it's far from that. And I hope and pray that this government is swept from office this October, and that Canadians push the next government to repeal any such laws that have been passed, with a view of preventing any government in the future to so easily either ignore at best, but at worst usurp our charter. Finally, I go back to the United States. I wanted also to play a piece that comes from my favourite president, probably yours as well. Now, this is a president that I felt kept me safe in the UK as I was starting out on my career, that being obviously the name Ronald Reagan. Just as a side point, I remember travelling to the United States when I was very young, and I remember saying to myself, when we crossed the border reaching Newfoundland, I feel safe now. We're under the nuclear umbrella. Silly maybe that is, but it was a very scary time. I used to wake up in the morning, go to work and say, I'll see you in the morning, God willing. Now this piece, apart from the figures referring to financial conditions for the period, seems as apt today as it did back then. So in my mind, as far as we move forward in time, we have only to look back to see where we are today. Here's that piece from the Reagan Library, A Time for Choosing by Ronald Reagan. Just an aside, that as I took this piece, the number of people that had viewed it, now it doesn't mean the number of people who actually saw it, is more than 2.3 million. All you can say about that is, wow. Here it is, 10/27/64.
The following pre-recorded political program is sponsored by TV for Goldwater Miller on behalf of Barry Goldwater, Republican candidate for President of the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, we take pride in presenting a thoughtful address by Ronald Reagan. Mr. Reagan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you and good evening. The sponsor has been identified, but unlike most television programs, the performer hasn't been provided with a script. As a matter of fact, I have been permitted to choose my own words and discuss my own ideas regarding the choice that we face in the next few weeks. I have spent most of my life as a Democrat. I recently have seen fit to follow another course. I believe that the issues confronting us cross party lines. Now, one side in this campaign has been telling us that the issues of this election are the maintenance of peace and prosperity. The line has been used, we've never had it so good. But I have an uncomfortable feeling that this prosperity isn't something on which we can base our hopes for the future. No nation in history has ever survived a tax burden that reached a third of its national income. Today, 37 cents out of every dollar earned in this country is the tax collector's share. And yet our government continues to spend $17 million a day more than the government takes in. We haven't balanced our budget 28 out of the last 34 years. We've raised our debt limit 3 times in the last 12 months. And now our national debt is 1.5 times bigger than all the combined debts of all the nations of the world. We have $15 billion in gold in our treasury. We don't own an ounce. Foreign dollar claims are $27.3 billion. And we've just had announced that the dollar of 1939 will now purchase 45 cents in its total value. As for the peace that we would preserve, I wonder who among us would like to approach the wife or mother whose husband or son has died in South Vietnam and ask them if they think this is a peace that should be maintained indefinitely. Do they mean peace, or do they mean we just want to be left in peace? There can be no real peace while one American is dying someplace in the world for the rest of us. We're at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind in his long climb from the swamp to the stars. And it's been said if we lose that war, and in so doing lose this way of freedom of ours, history will record with the greatest astonishment that those who had the most to lose did the least to prevent its happening. Well, I think it's time we ask ourselves if we still know the freedoms that were intended for us by the Founding Fathers. Not too long ago, 2 friends of mine were talking to a Cuban refugee, a businessman who had escaped from Castro. And in the midst of his story, one of my friends turned to the other and said, "We don't know how lucky we are." And the Cuban stopped and said, "How lucky you are. I had some place to escape to." And in that sentence, he told us the entire story. If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. And this idea that government is beholden to the people, that it has no other source of power except the sovereign people, is still the newest and the most unique idea in all the long history of man's relation to man. This is the issue of this election. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves. You and I are told increasingly we have to choose between a left or right. Well, I'd like to suggest there is no such thing as a left or right. There's only an up or down. Man's old age dream, the ultimate in individual freedom consistent with law and order, or down to the ant-heap of totalitarianism. And regardless of their sincerity, their humanitarian motives, those who would trade our freedom for security have embarked on this downward course. In this vote harvesting time, they use terms like the Great Society, or as we were told a few days ago by the President, we must accept a greater government activity in the affairs of the people. But they've been a little more explicit in the past, and among themselves, and all of the things I now will quote have appeared in print. These are not Republican accusations. For example, they have voices that say the Cold War will end through our acceptance of a not undemocratic socialism. Another voice says the profit motive has become outmoded. It must be replaced by the incentives of the welfare state. Or our traditional system of individual freedom is incapable of solving the complex problems of the 20th century. Senator Fulbright has said at Stanford University that the Constitution is outmoded. He referred to the President as our moral teacher and our leader. And he says he is hobbled in his task by the restrictions of power imposed on him by this antiquated document. He must be freed so that he can do for us what he knows is best. And Senator Clark of Pennsylvania, another articulate spokesman, defines liberalism as meeting the material needs of the masses through the full power of centralized government. Well, I, for one, resent it when a representative of the people refers to you and me, the free men and women of this country, as the masses. This is a term we haven't applied to ourselves in America. But beyond that, the full power of centralized government, this was the very thing the Founding Fathers sought to minimize. They knew that governments don't control things. A government can't control the economy without controlling people. And they know when a government sets out to do that, it must use force and coercion to achieve its purpose. They also knew, those Founding Fathers, that outside of its legitimate functions, government does nothing as well or as economically as the private sector of the economy.
Now, I wanted to play that clip, as I said, to highlight that nothing really has changed. The battle today is the same as it was some 55 years ago. We are still fighting for freedom and democracy. Unfortunately, back then, 55 years ago, that was actually being fought by the military, thousands of miles away. Today, our enemy is as close as the next street and the nearest town to you. Sounds dramatic, but the truth is that the supposedly good-intentioned, and we have to assume that, don't we, good-intentioned politicians have unleashed upon many Western nations the beginning of a fight of civilization. A fight for all our beliefs, not just those fluffy, intangible ones. This fight, the outcome of which will shape our societies not just for 10 or 20 years ahead, but literally hundreds, if not tens of hundreds of years into the future. We cannot, we will not fail. We cannot afford to fail. It is our responsibility for those who have yet been born to protect their liberties both now and into the future. You can find more at aradio.wordpress.com, where you can find links to us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Gab, and email. We are also on Spotify. Just go to the podcast section and type Canadian Politics with a twist, and you'll find us. We are continuing to reach out to you, so please pass on the links. Please click on the follow button on Spreaker.com. You can listen to all our morning moments at Spreaker.com under A Radio. That's EHRADIO, A Radio. And please click on the like button. And you can now hear a weekend review of our podcasts on WHBJ DB, News Talk Radio. Join us and many others, and you can find all our podcasts and morning moments at aradio.wordpress.com. Click on the Morning Moments tab.